This is Future Sense Now, where we explore the landscape and byways of our shared futures. Future Sense Now is brought to you by the Futures Forum. Stay tuned for a journey to the future with host Dr. Claire Nelson.
Greetings and welcome to Future Sense Now, an online e-magazine of the Futures Forum. It is May 2018, and this month we're celebrating World Telecommunications and Information Society Day with an exploration into the futures of artificial intelligence. The theme of this year's celebration is enabling the positive use of artificial intelligence for all, and focuses on the potential of AI to accelerate the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, we know that the progress in AI technology has been made because of the tremendous advances in big data, machine learning, storage capacity, cloud computing, and so on. And to some extent, it's already being used to help people lead better lives by improving healthcare, education, finance, and a wide range of other services. The question then is, can AI really allow countries to accelerate the achievements of wider prosperity for all by 2030? Or is there another side to AI, the one we fear? In this segment, we will be speaking to Steve Wells, who is Director of Operations of Fast Future Publishing. He's an experienced strategist, futures analyst, and what he calls a partnership working practitioner. But more importantly, for our purposes, he is co-author of a new book, well, a relatively new book, called Beyond Genuine Stupidity. Subtitle, Ensuring AI Serves Humanity. Now, he has a wide range of experience working with companies that have done scenario development, futures analysis, and so on. So let's hear more about Steve's perspective on AI. How are you, Steve? Good morning. Greetings.
Good morning, Claire. I'm brilliant.
Well, actually, it's morning for me and it's afternoon for you because you are in the UK and I'm on the East Coast of the United States of America. How are you?
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Wow. Now, a title like that, I don't know where to start. I mean, when I first came into this AI cognition, so to speak, I come to it from growing up in the era of Star Trek. That's the first introduction to space. Actually, the first introduction to space and those kind of scientific things was Lost in Space.
Me too.
I'm really dating myself, right? and then came Star Trek, and I became a Trekkie all through my teens and early 20s, and then the various versions of Star Trek. And then came iRobot and movies like The Matrix and Minority Report. So, yes, we've been living with more, let's say, ubiquitous AI in terms of customer service applications and smart buffs like Alexa and Siri. But, that fear for people like me is still there. Which of these AI scenarios are real and which are not?
Well, part of me says kind of elements of a lot of what we talk about in some of the really good science fiction is likely to play out in our future. I mean, to those movies that you've just mentioned, when we think about the context of AI, I would add Terminator and RoboCop. And if we can park for 1 second time travel, which may be a little bit more complicated than we're seeing in AI, there are elements of how computers can take control of the way that we might 3D print machines, the way that machines may take over the production and replication of themselves. If we think about some of the notions in RoboCop, then actually we're talking about corporations using data in order to take over the running of a city. So I think there's some really interesting stories there. Now, of course, the other thing that we tend to see with science fiction is a very dystopian perspective. So I guess it's up to us as society and as humans generally to make some choices about whether we want to allow tech companies to retain control of these incredibly powerful and radically changing technologies? Or do we want to do something as a society to democratize access to some of these technologies, to try and regulate their use, their deployment, their development? Because there are some well-documented fears for some very smart people like Professor Stephen Hawking about the kind of dystopian future we might see if we don't put things in place to help us manage the development and the deployment of some of these technologies. So there are some really important issues, I think, at stake.
So we're talking about, for our purposes, the idea of ending poverty and hunger everywhere, combating inequalities, empowerment of women and girls, human rights, peaceful, just societies, etc. And then we're doing this against the backdrop of the U.S. Isn't really concerned about data privacy and all the hacks, and then of course the election hacks, and then fake news. So when you say beyond genuine stupidity, I'm trying to, first of all, I love the name. What is genuine stupidity in the context of our press to use AI and ICTs to address the real challenges?
I think the genuine stupidity we're looking to take people beyond it is basically ignoring the inevitable developments around those technologies that will happen. Yes. We also think that the genuine stupidity would be in not trying to put something in place that pays attention to the way these technologies are developed and deployed. So we have just an incredible opportunity to create a very human future through the deployment, the development, the democratization of these kind of technologies for the good of humanity.
I definitely want to catch it. I want to make sure I catch that, because just so I like the phrasing. So the two, let's say, main beyond genuine stupidity would be the stupidity of not paying attention to, let's say, the nefarious uses of these growing technologies. Yeah. And then beyond stupidity, the stupidity of not ensuring that we have the policies and regulations and laws to ensure that we do. Is that what you said? I want to make sure I get that.
That's exactly right. I mean, I'd kind of had a third one there as well, because businesses can't afford, I don't think, to ignore the kind of technologies that we're seeing. Whether it's data mining, whether it's kind of marketing technologies, whether it's through recruitment, whatever it is, there's a whole bunch of these new applications, AI-based applications that help businesses operate more effectively. So, there's a third dimension there as well, which is, as a business, do we actually pay attention to the availability of these technologies? Or do we display genuine stupidity and hide our heads in the sand and say, I'm just going to carry on doing what I've always done?
So let's come up to the larger, so there's the business aspect of it in terms of data manipulation for HR, for example. One of the concerns some people are having is that since the AIs are programmed in the first place, will they be programmed with biases? Will the very human future we want be, what do you call it, delayed, or whatever that word is I'm looking for, you know what it is. Because AI is being asked to basically not only sift through 1,000 applications in the first instant, but also make the final choice. How are you seeing AI, for example, being used in the human resources framework?
Well, in terms of human resources framework, you can probably see AI being used, and let's think about this as a good thing, being used to monitor what's happening in the organization, monitor performance, matching the needs of the organization to the resources that are available, both inside the organization and outside. So let's imagine that we subscribe to a particular database that has our skills and our experience listed. Then maybe that organization can search not only inside but outside the organization, that database, to make sure that the resources it acquires absolutely match the needs of the organization. So that's one way that you can see that happening. You can kind of see artificial intelligence doing a pretty good job at performance management as well, about monitoring what happens within the course of a particular piece of work or a particular project. So on the one hand, there's kind of there's perhaps a fear there that the machines are watching us and taking control. But actually, what if it helps us do the right thing at the right time in the right way to maximize our earning potential, and we get the appropriate reward and recognition for the job that we're doing? So I think that, and that maybe talks to the real heart of what we see as one of the issues around the implementation of artificial intelligence. It has the ability to be very good for society, for humanity, for our businesses. It also provides the ability for people to be very manipulative, for a surveillance society to be very controlling. So like most technologies, it can be used for good and it can be used for bad. And that's what's kind of at the heart of, of going beyond genuine stupidity. What is it we need to do to make sure we harness these technologies for the greater good?
So, I mean, I have to tell you that when I worked as the vice president of a staff association for the large international organization in which I worked, performance management was a huge factor. We were in knowledge business. We were in the knowledge business. I mean, we're providing counsel to countries and governments and private sectors who are borrowing to put in large infrastructure projects. And I can tell you, even though most of the people in that space are, let's say, master's degrees and PhDs, the average, even the secretaries had master's degrees, right? Quote unquote. In fact, they're called administrative professionals, the new term, right?
Yep.
Performance management was the most sticky and thorny things because of the personalities of the people involved. So I don't think we can argue that today, but at some point perhaps we'll have a beer, even a virtual beer, and talk about performance management and AI. But as we look at this idea in a larger context of good uses, and we look at the way society is structured and our challenge now to just even find work. So AI doing this job of performance management is taking away, I would assume, the job of the performance manager. So here we are again, even in jobs that people formerly thought were safe from being automated, because of the learning faculty of these new systems, they're now being taught to do this. How far is this going to go? Are we really going to get to a place where work is all automated and humans supposedly have time to go off and play? Now, I don't know who would pay us to play, but how is this? What does your book say about this?
Well, I mean, we're really starting to get, I think, to the heart of the question. And but the real base here is we don't know. That's the thing. We don't know if the amount of jobs that are going to be lost to automation will be offset by a raft of new technologies, including artificial intelligence, coming in to create new sectors, to create new businesses. So there's a big unknown there. And from my point of view, some of the things that you were talking about there, the real heart of this is that whilst technology is the cause for the complexity and the uncertainty, it manifests itself as a societal issue. So we have some choices we make about how we treat people, how we educate people, how we train people, how we move people around in the economy. We also potentially have a choice about what we do if automation makes such a radical difference to the job and work landscape that we need to find something to occupy ourselves because 50% of us are no longer working. So we do have all that leisure time that you just spoke about. Now there we link back into, so what might we do as a part of a social system in order to create wealth for people to still have the leisure time to be able to study, to become more spiritual, whatever it is they might want to do. And we start to get into the realm of what about universal basic income? What about universal basic services? Then we move into how do we fund it? Do we tax the robots? What do we mean by do we tax the robots? How do we how do we redistribute the wealth given that very different perspective we see potentially in the work environment? And I think going back then to kind of the really big issue that you mentioned right at the top of the piece here, which is very much about sustainability and the way that we think about sustainability in the future. So start to think about, from a company perspective, how do I create a sustainable economic model for my business? Well, maybe whilst my motivation is profit, then I move out as many jobs as I can. I automate as much as I can because machines are cheaper than people at the moment. So until the dynamic changes between that motivation and what governments provide within the social systems, then I'm not too sure we'll get a different outcome than increasing unemployment. And I think that goes to the heart of what we're going to be increasingly talking about around sustainability, because immediately there are issues there about poverty, about health, about sustainable economics, about gender equality. That goes really to the heart of some of the critical things that the United Nations talks about in the 17 Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah, and I think that as I think through this, I think that one of the things that I kind of have feathering on my consciousness as I'm hearing this idea about AI and the future of work and the future of like, sustainable development goals. It's all well and good to talk about AI from the perspective of, yes, answering phones and those kinds of things, right? And it's good to talk about robots that say do dangerous work of undersea mining or et cetera, But again, if we're talking now about artificial generalized intelligence, which is the next, let's say, level up, and if indeed Ray Kurzweil has any, truth in his statement that the singularity is upon us as in the next 15 years, of course the date keeps getting pushed back, but still, the date is still there, right? So I guess my question is, how do we really have this conversation in the global sense? Yes, there are lots of rules. So we know, for example, the World Telecommunications Systems meets every year. The spectrum management people meet every year. The fintech rules people meet every year. How do we ensure that the policymakers actually understand these questions? Because I'm afraid many times we're having policymakers and staff of policymakers who are not even themselves aware of the potential of these technologies. How do we make these people become more aware of wider spectrum of what could happen?
I mean, I think that's a very hard question to answer. I suppose one of the things that I think that we do in Fast Future is hopefully surface this debate. So the conversation that we're having now, and the people that watch this interview, will kind of hopefully be increasingly aware about the significance of the issues that we're talking about. I think that needs to be replicated right around the world. I think there needs to be a way that bodies like the United Nations can really kind of promote these arguments, because without any doubt, some of the things that the United Nations are doing and saying around the Sustainability Development Goals provide not just a template for nations, but I think they provide a template for companies as well. So if we look at the kind of work that corporate knights are doing as an example to rate the sustainability credentials of global corporations, then we can see a really interesting correlation between the UN goals as well as the dimensions that corporate knights are using to assess sustainability, from the way they treat employees to their environmental credentials, to the way they work with their suppliers. There's a whole raft of different dimensions that they use. So I think those kind of debates, it's really about surfacing those at every opportunity we can. I always think there's kind of almost a quiet agreement between government and business that's very short-termism. So if I'm in a business that's operating globally, I have shareholders to think about. So every 3, 6, 9, 12 months, my focus is on what are the messages that I'm sending to markets about the good job we're doing with our investors' money. Every electoral cycle, governments are kind of trying to formulate a marketing campaign in order to sell their proposition to the electorate. So you've got business and government that are kind of working on this reasonably short-term perspective. Now, underneath all that, we know there's lots of really good work going on where we do kind of surface these issues. We do look at what we mean by sustainability. We do look at some of the issues about taking the opportunity to increase wealth, to think about gender equality, all that really good stuff. that the UN has kind of brought to the surface with the development goals.
Uh-huh.
But something I think needs to happen to really bring it into a local policy environment. So one of the things that I think happened recently was a bit of a missed opportunity with Theresa May in the UK. So the UK Prime Minister at Davos a couple of months ago
Yeah.
wanted to speak about some of the ethics around, for example, the way that we use social media and the opportunities that AI represented.
Uh-huh.
She kind of started off really well, and then she went back into a fairly traditional perspective, which is there's lots of global economic growth around now, and we can see that being forecast in the future. One
Uh-huh.
of the areas of economic growth is going to be around AI. So in the
Yeah.
UK, we're going to establish an AI centre of excellence. We're
Uh-huh.
going to underpin that with investment in training and education. And
Uh-huh.
as the world economy grows, the additional business we'll bring to the UK will offset the impact of any jobs that might be lost to automation. She didn't say that bit, but I think that was kind of implicit.
Uh-huh.
But that's really based on existing past models of how we expect countries to respond to changes in the global economic environment. So if we go back to what we were talking about a couple of minutes ago, what happens to the global economy if all of a sudden automation replaces 50% of the jobs around the world?
Yeah.
Something has to change. And at the moment, I have no doubt that in some countries, we're seeing lots of really good work, and we know there are some experiments about UBI happening around the world. But where is that actually going into policy in some of the bigger economies around the world? Not even necessarily to change what we're doing now, but to introduce some of these notions that we might need to change. So how do we then develop into policy and strategy flexibility and resilience given some of these uncertainties? Because they're massive uncertainties. The impact
Yeah. Yeah.
of mass unemployment around the world really brings brings into question social cohesion. It raises the notion of conflict. It raises the increasing gap between the haves and the have-nots.
I can tell you right now, if any developing country that I have been to were to say replace your supermarket cashiers with cashiering, or the gas station attendants with gas station attendants pumping your own gas, it'll be total havoc. Because you're talking about a good percentage of the, let's say, the low wage and people in the formal economy, because you're in the formal economy because you're employed by a supermarket, you're employed by a gas station owner, so they're not informal. They would push those people out into the informal economy, but at what cost? We have already the situation where in many of our developing countries, we're living behind walls, we're living behind burglar bars, we're living with armed guards. And so is that we want more of the same? So I think that as you think through the very human future, I want you to tell me more of what is this very human future that you see we need to sort of intentionally now imagine and construct against this new, let's say, layer of AI being as ubiquitous as electricity and telephone systems. What is this very human future? How are you pulling it into being?
Yeah, that's putting some responsibility on us, isn't it? I suppose. I mean, one of the things that we're trying to do is help people envision some of the things that we need to resolve in order to take us toward a very human future. So I wouldn't claim that that we have some solutions. I wouldn't claim that we have a whole bunch of scenarios already ready to go that really describe what we mean by a very human future. What we're really thinking of is I think, trying to bring into people's consciousness. And when I say people here, I'm talking about government, I'm talking about the not-for-profit sector as well as for business. And to try to help people understand that there is an implication in the way that we automate, in the way that we change the way that we run our businesses, in the way that we change the way that we run government. So we know, we can understand, we can see the potential for artificial intelligence and other technologies to change the world for the good. However, what we're currently seeing at the moment, and I'm going to generalize massively here, is I think we're seeing artificial intelligence used for efficiency.
Yes.
We're not really seeing, even though people tell us, artificial intelligence used to increase the experience that we as consumers have when we go to the supermarket, when we go to the bank, or whatever it might be. So one of the things that we really do need to start to think about, I think, is what is it that we mean by delivering value to our consumers, if it's government service, to our populations. How is it we can make their lives easier? How then can we use the technology in order to deliver that? And then how do we wrap a business model around that in order to make sure that we utilize that appropriate technology to deliver the service to the people? So that seems to me to be the right kind of thing to do, the right kind of way to go.
And so that brings me to, I guess, one of my critical questions, and possibly my last question, or second to last question, is then meaningful metrics. Because if we're measuring still GNP and GDP, which were metrics designed for an agrarian / into the industrial age, to measure what is value and what is valuable, and what is valued, right? In a knowledge service economy with AI as a fundamental part of the service provision, then we are certainly going to make ourselves extinct or close to extinct, because we will create the social conditions that create a cascading effect of social deconstruction, social incohesion, social inequality, etc., etc. So help me. You see, you didn't do a lot of scenarios, but could you help us think through or state in 2030 what is one potential headline you would see in an AI invested or infested?
Invested or infested?
AI infested or invested world. What is our scenario headline for 2030?
I suppose the scenario headline there is artificial intelligence available to all. I suppose one of the things with all these new technologies is we need to build trust in them. We need to understand that when we commit ourselves to AI, that we can trust what it's doing with our data, with our information, and recent events have maybe put that particular debate back a little bit. So if we think about some of the things that have emerged with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, those are some of the things that we've really got to get over. So if I'm thinking about what we might see in 2030, I think it's about us having total trust, because the providers of digital services have behaved in a way that's been transparent, that's allowed us to believe that what they tell us is real, that what we read and what we see is real. So that the concept, the notion around fake news has been dealt a blow. Maybe that's been dealt a blow because we have sophisticated AI that's able to look at stories, search the underlying information to make sure that what we're seeing and hearing, listening to is actually real. So those are some of the things that I think would need to fill, and that would be a very positive headline in 2030. And the thing about those things, they actually go back to this being about society and about, as you've really spoken about, social cohesion. They're not about the technology. They're about how us as humans respond to what technology can help us create.
So, to close, are you optimistic, pessimistic, or neutralistic that we can go beyond genuine stupidity and ensure a very human future?
I am optimistic, and the reason I'm optimistic is the dystopian perspective is so awful to contemplate. Surely common sense will prevail, won't it?
Well, that's it, folks. We're so delighted, Steve Wells, that you could spend some time with us. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So that's it. Thank you for joining us on Future Sense Now, where we explore salient ideas for sustainable futures. We have been speaking with Steve Wells, who is head of operations for Fast Future Publishing. He's a futurist, an experienced strategist, and co-author, one of 5 co-authors of the book Beyond Genuine Stupidity, Ensuring that AI Serves Humanity. We've come to the end of another great conversation, but the story for our future continues being written by all of us. Remember, our future is embedded in both the DNA of our past and the landscape of our present. And we are indeed parents of our shared future. So as we say in Jamaica, walk good and safe journeys.
You have been listening to Future Sense Now with Dr. Claire Nelson, brought to you by the Futures Forum. For more, please visit www.thefuturesforum.org. Thank you for listening. Spread the word. Share the future.